The influence of proximity to failure on different training adaptations has become an extremely popular topic recently. However, from a practical perspective, the decision on how close to failure to train always comes down to the delicate balance of stimulus and fatigue. In today's video, we'll examine the research on proximity to failure and fatigue to help inform your training. You've probably heard an argument that goes something like this. While training to failure may be more stimulative for muscle growth on a per set basis, it is exponentially more fatiguing. This fatigue can negatively impact performance on later sets, exercises, or even weeks within a mesocycle. While I don't think this statement is wrong per se, I think the evidence it's based upon is a lot less clear than many think. Essentially, all the data that we have on this topic is extremely short-term, examining the fatigue responses to a given proximity to failure after only a single workout. If we applied a similar epistemic standard to this topic as we would any other new supplement or training approach, we would be very wary of applying this evidence to longitudinal training outcomes like hypertrophy. As an example, let's take caffeine. There are numerous meta-analyses that demonstrate the acute performance benefits of caffeine. However, until recently, we didn't know if these acute outcomes actually manifested into better adaptations over time. In this case, it does seem like the acute data do seem to play out into marginally better adaptations, but this isn't always the case. There's also a phenomenon called the repeated bout effect that is really well established. This is where adaptations occur, sometimes as even as short as 24 hours, that make the same stimulus less fatiguing over time. This can be a massive confounding variable when it comes to speculating how the acute fatigue research plays out over time to impact longitudinal adaptations like muscle growth. These results seem to have a shelf life. With those important clarifications out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the research on this topic. The acute data can best be summarized by a meta-analysis by Vieira and colleagues. In this analysis, the authors compared groups training to failure to those training at submaximal RARs. Training to failure resulted in greater increases in biomechanical, metabolic, and perceptual proxies of fatigue, even when total volume was equated. However, a limitation of the studies included in this analysis was that the non-failure groups trained very far from failure, typically greater than 4 reps in reserve, which obviously doesn't represent the way that most people typically train, particularly for hypertrophy. Thankfully, 2 studies have been published since this analysis to help paint the picture a bit more clearly. These studies by Ruffalo and Mangine both examine the influence of proximity to failure on acute neuromuscular fatigue following multiple sets of bench press in trained individuals using a randomized crossover design. In the Ruffalo study, each participant trained with a 3 RAR, 1 RAR, and failure conditions. In the results of this study, there was essentially a linear relationship between the acute fatigue demonstrated and the proximity to failure, such that the failure condition was the most fatiguing. In the Mangine study, each participant completed the condition with each set taken to failure, or in another condition where most sets were taken with 3 RAR, except the last set was taken to failure. The RAR condition observed better quality performance during the session, but proxies of recovery weren't significantly different between the conditions for up to 72 hours after the workout. Ultimately, I think these results suggest that there is a pretty strong relationship between the acute fatigue experience and proximity to failure, even at RARs in which people actually train. In fact, in the Mangine study, even performing just 1 set to momentary failure seemed to even the playing field with respect to muscle damage and some of the other recovery variables. However, as mentioned, while this data is interesting, how do participants adapt to a given proximity to failure over time? To my knowledge, there are really only 3 studies that examine the influence of proximity to failure on fatigue longitudinally. The first study that examines fatigue longitudinally is a study by Pareja, Blanco, and colleagues. In this study, the authors examine acute fatigue differences between a condition training to failure and another performing about half the maximum possible repetitions, somewhere around 5 RAR. As expected, training to failure led to a greater acute fatigue response, but then the participants trained for 10 weeks and completed the half possible repetitions condition again to see if their fatigue responses change over the course of time. This time, the fatigue responses were considerably diminished, demonstrating that participants adapted over time. However, a limitation of this study is that it didn't test the failure condition again, so we can't know if these adaptations are RAR specific. The next study is by Walker and colleagues. Male and female participants were randomized into one of 2 groups, a 20% velocity loss group and a 40% velocity loss group. As we mentioned before on the channel, a higher velocity loss threshold will have participants training closer to failure and with more repetition volume at a given number of sets. Similar to the last study, the authors tested the acute fatigue response to the protocol each participant was assigned to, trained for 8 weeks, and then tested the fatigue response again. Acutely, the authors found that the 40% velocity loss groups demonstrated greater fatigue, particularly in the males. However, after about 8 weeks of training, both sex and protocol-specific differences vanished. This demonstrates that habituation to a given RIR likely applies to conditions training closer to failure as well. That said, I'd like to see this study replicated with a crossover design in which each participant trains with all the acute protocols to solidify these findings further. The final study that can offer us some insight is a recent preprint from our lab. We had participants train the squat and bench press for 8 weeks among other accessory exercises to either a self-reported 4 to 6, 1 to 3, or 0 RIR condition. We measured the acute fatigue response at weeks 1, 2, and 7 of the training program. Crucially, we had multiple dropouts in the 0 RIR condition that ultimately was terminated after only 3 participants completed it due to training-related injury and discomfort. Thus, it's important to consider survivorship bias in any of the results that we did see. With that said, despite some minor differences in soreness and session RPE, the fatigue responses were largely the same between conditions and didn't seem to change much over the course of the training program. With these limitations acknowledged, it seems to suggest yet again that there may not be a massive difference in fatigue to a given proximity to failure after habituation. I also think it's important to question the causal link between acute fatigue and longitudinal adaptations like hypertrophy. Just think about a few training variables that tend to lead to greater fatigue. Higher volumes, training closer to failure, moderate to high repetition ranges. All of these seem to benefit hypertrophy to some degree, despite leading to more acute fatigue. So I would question the premise that fatigue is always a bad thing or it's some sort of boogeyman. If this was the case, it should show up in longitudinal evidence. Sure, if your performance absolutely tanks with a given configuration of training, or if there are any concerns of injury, that is likely suboptimal. And there are definitely cases in the literature where this does seem to manifest longitudinally, namely rest intervals is one example. But marginal decreases in performance, I think, are often overstated in their impact. A good training program aims to balance the anticipated stimulus with the anticipated fatigue. However, it's crucial to keep in mind that neither the stimulus or the fatigue are static entities. They can adapt as you habituate to a given training protocol. While the data with regards to proximity to failure and fatigue are in their infancy, I think there is some indication that we do indeed adapt to a given RIR upon repeated exposure to it. Thus, while the acute data suggests that training to failure may be substantially more fatiguing, I would make programming decisions based on an individual's fatigue tolerance and trajectory of key performance indicators, rather than the assumption that the acute data will generalize to the longitudinal adaptations of a specific lifter. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and let us know what you want to see from us next in the comments below. And if you want more free content like this directly in your inbox, sign up for our newsletter, which is the first link below.